Thank you, everybody, so much. It's so great. I'm so impressed with this organization, with this room, with this weather, with this city. I feel like I'm in another country right now. And so it's just so terrific to be with you all tonight. I know it was a major effort for some of you to get here, and so I will do my best to make it worth your while. This is a geology talk, and some of you know exactly what I'm going to be talking about. Some of you, not all of you, maybe just a small portion, I'm not quite sure, but some of you have been with me for the last 4 years on YouTube primarily, and in particular this past winter, where I was working with a live audience and folks watching in replay, and we were learning from each other. And so much of tonight is from the viewers, research that the viewers have done. So it's an unusual thing that I'm this authority figure talking about geology, but I'm not an authority figure at all. I'm just somebody who's learning from people at home who have found certain things, and my job is just to put some narratives together for everyone else. So, it's a geology talk, but it's also a talk about people 100 years ago and today. Shall we begin? Yeah. Okay, all right, let's do it. So, yes, we're talking about J. Harlen Bretz, and some of you are huge geology fans, and you think, I know all about J. Harlen Bretz. I know all about the Missoula floods. Come on, man, you're going to tell me anything new? We have Vic Baker in the room. We have Jim O'Connor here in the room. We have Scott Burns in the room. These are the folks who've been teaching about this stuff forever and doing major contributions to this work. But yes, I do have some new stuff tonight. But it's old stuff. New discoveries based on very old work that I found fascinating, and I wonder if we should revisit some of that. So that's really what we're doing tonight. But I think we need to start and include everybody, whether you know about me and YouTube or not, whether you know about the Missoula floods and J. Harlen Bretz or not. I want to make this work for everybody. And I know that some of you were part of the YouTube learning community, but I'm going to talk to you like you weren't part of it, okay? That's our little deal. I'm just going to talk to everybody, so I'm not going to assume you know any inside jokes about Patrick or the Bishop, the cat, or any of that stuff. We're just going to pretend that doesn't exist. Okay, so here we go, fast-paced, just to get everybody on the same page. We okay? Missoula floods, roughly 20,000 years ago. Now that's a very rough number, but that's tied to marine isotope stage 2, the last glacial maximum impacting the Pacific Northwest. These are maps from Daniel Coe, Washington Geological Survey. What do we have? Glacial Lake Missoula, the source of the Missoula floods, Missoula, Montana, breakthrough an ice dam in northern Idaho. Have that water catastrophically get into channels in eastern Washington, the channeled scablands, Grand Coulee, Moses Coulee, Telford Crab Creek, Cheney Palouse. That water, regardless of its path, is heading for Wallula Gateway, as J. Harlen Bretz used to call it, now known more favorably as Wallula Gap. We pond some water in southern Washington. We have some backup of some stagnant water up to Yakima, Washington, up to Walla Walla. We continue. Now we get the water getting closer to you guys. This Ice Age flood, this Missoula flood is coming through the Columbia River Gorge. It's getting choked down in certain places. It's moving beautifully in other places in the gorge. It's getting to Portland. It's getting all the way down to Jack Zentner's house in Eugene, Oregon. It drains away. It goes to the Pacific Ocean, and we're good. That's one Missoula flood. Those are the Missoula floods, plural. There were dozens of Missoula floods. This is old hat to almost everybody in the room, I think. So we're moving quickly. But let's just keep going with the old, conventional, major message, which is valuable. It's important work. Tom Foster photos. High water mark of Lake Missoula. This is where the water started. This glacial lake filling many of the valleys of western Montana. High water marks above the campus of the University of Montana. Shorelines. Was that one lake? Was each shoreline a different lake? Can we tease that out? That's a question, but let's move on. Finally, when we get that Missoula water out of Montana, we get it through northern Idaho, we get it to eastern Washington, these kinds of features are created. This is Potholes Coulee, known locally. This is pretty close to where I live in Ellensburg, Washington, known locally as Ancient Lakes. 2 canyons, side by side, no river in them. Plunge pools, curved cliffs. J. Harlen Bretz was intrigued by maps of this area. Mouth of Moses Coulee. This is just a quick little survey of the key famous places close to where I live in central Washington. This is downstream of Wenatchee, Washington. These are the walls of the Grand Coulee, where I was yesterday with Jordan Carey, a young professor that I'm introducing every Thursday afternoon to these places. I'll post that video next week. Dry Falls. So how many people have been to Dry Falls in central Washington? Okay, wow, like half of you, all right. Yeah, this is a state park. It's, for many people in Washington, a place just to stop and use the restroom and get an ice cream cone. But I guess we're out of the car, we might as well read one of these placards. And it's talking about an Ice Age waterfall. Most people visualize Niagara Falls, but when I got a program that was shown on television, there was a little bit of a budget, and they said, what do you want? You want an animation? I'm like, I would love an animation for Dry Falls, but I don't want Niagara Falls. It bothers me that people look at that cliff and visualize Dry Falls. So I had some animators work with me and some others, and we put in more than the water of Niagara Falls. I think we were conservative. I really do. I think we were conservative, and we're going to look at a few of these animations over the next 45 minutes and revisit with some new ideas about this story. But that's one way to view Dry Falls. So who did the animation? They're downtown Portland. And I was visiting one of my kids down here a few years ago, BP, before the pandemic. And I went into Newland's Associates and just knocked on the door unannounced. And I was like, oh yeah, you guys still working on the Dry Falls thing? I'd like to meet you guys. How do you do that? And back and forth and talking. They do kind of animations for a variety of projects. But this is Ray working at his workstation, and he talked about, he was proud of how many BTUs he was using. What was the thing? I don't know. BTUs, give me a break. All right. So we took drone footage. We lifted a drone from the parking lot at Dry Falls and then sent it down to Ray, and Ray is putting in the water. And these are more appropriate, perhaps at least a step forward towards understanding the magnitude of the Missoula floods. Or are they the Missoula floods? Were they the Missoula floods? Now I'm starting to lead us towards the heart of the talk. Other features, giant current ripples. These are not in Montana. These are in the county that I live in. These are a place called West Bar along the Columbia River. There's a boat for scale. Boat for scale. There's loess on top of the basalt all across eastern Washington. Wind-blown silt sitting on top of roughly 16 million-year-old basalt lava. Most famously in southeastern Washington, those rolling hills of Palouse wheat are the loess fields. But there are places dramatically where those loess fields are gone and been stripped away by the Missoula floods. And where did that silt go? Where did that material go that should be there in the Palouse? Well, it got redeposited in southern Washington. This is Wallula Gap. This is Walla Walla. This is a Bruce Bjornstad image, a beautiful one of Lake Lewis. So we pick up that loess by the water, we redeposit it repeatedly on the floor of Lake Lewis, and so now we have a textbook. Now we have a way to go event by event, and there's still discussion about how to read these individual layers. Multiple points of view. Famously, near Walla Walla, there's a canyon called Burlingame Canyon, which didn't exist until the 1920s when a farmer lost control of his irrigation canal, and suddenly this was cut through these very, very soft silts. These also are part of the Missoula flood story, but this is not canyon work. This is delicate slackwater sediment layers. Are each of these a separate flood or not? Are each of those layers from a Missoula flood or not? Thankfully, we have some dates that we can get from within those slackwater sediments. Volcanic ash layers sandwiched between slackwater sediments. This one, a Mount St. Helens volcanic ash deposit, beautifully clean between two slackwater sediment layers. In other words, within the Missoula flood sediments. And there's two of them. It's a coupling. Two different eruptions. So that's the story here. In the gorge, getting closer to Portland, There's a whole suite, right? There's a whole suite of features that are all telling this story. They're all unified by one story that involves 4 or 5 states and a couple of provinces, depending on who you talk to. And some of those boulders that were moved by the floods were clearly deposited by icebergs. The icebergs carrying boulders from the north. The iceberg gets lodged. The boulder then gets exposed to solar radiation, and we can calculate using a relatively new technique by breaking off a portion of a selected boulder, measuring radiometric decay with some minerals that are exposed, and calculating how many years that boulder has been sitting out there in the sun, essentially. And these surface exposure dates are all coming in younger than 20,000 years ago. Seems like a Missoula flood story. There are erratics all over. There's always a reaction to that photo. I don't care what the audience is. There's always a stir in the air. This is right off of the freeway outside of Pasco, right out in the middle of a vineyard. I'm still just reviewing and getting everybody on the same page. We're almost done with our first portion of our talk today. Roger Denlinger and Dan O'Connell putting this GeoSGS simulation together of the floods, and there is Lake Lewis. The colors are different depths of water, so go away from blue colors, we're getting into deeper and deeper water. In the gorge, are you aware? I drove a beautiful 4-hour drive from Ellensburg to here this afternoon. It couldn't have been more perfect, weather-wise and green color. Are you aware that there's a beautiful record of the Ice Age floods coming through the Columbia Gorge? I wasn't until just a few years ago. How many times have I taken that drive? The lower 2/3 of the walls are scoured. Basalt bedrock is exposed. There's scabland, there's potholes. And generally, the upper portion of the walls of the Columbia Gorge look very different. They're graceful. The contours are nice and tame. They have not been affected by the Ice Age floods. But every drop of water has to come through the Columbia River Gorge. Every drop of water has to come by the Vista House, maybe up to the parking lot of the Vista House. That is the Missoula flood story. Are we feeling comfortable? Does that sound mostly familiar? And you've taught yourself that through books or videos or lectures here in this society? I'm pausing for dramatic effect. No, that's good. No, that's good. No, I wasn't needing that. Thank you, though. Just pausing so that we're ready to take a step into some new stuff for some of you, maybe most of you, depending on how much you've been involved with us this winter. So yes, a couple of quick words. St. Patrick's Day 2020. I think I gave a talk to this group right before 2020. I think it was 2019. I was thinking of that driving down, and it was at the other room. And I freaked out in the spring of 2020, and my calendar was empty, like many people. I'm like, I got to do something, so I taught myself how to do live broadcasts from my backyard. And I did 5 of them a week. I was doing everything I could find around the house. And it was just fun for me to try to learn new things. And for the first, I think there were 75 of those episodes just in that spring. 5 of them a week. The first few I just did off the top of my head. I didn't do any preparation, but I finally ran out of material. So then I had to start getting friends to come over and get interviewed in my backyard and so on. The point is, I started to build this online audience, which up until this past winter was a passive audience, an appreciative audience, but a passive audience. But this past winter, I decided to ask the viewers for help. And that was a major change in how I operate, and I think I'm going to continue in the future. I did an A to Z Ice Age Floods live stream series from mid-November until just a few months ago. We finished in mid-February. And the rest of tonight is from that format. It's from those 26 episodes. And you'll see how I was getting information from the viewers. And you're like, I'm confused. You're just asking people watching at home, like in Portland, for help? Yes, because so much of it involved human stories and newspaper clippings and details about key characters. So we were going beyond the geology. But it was rooted in the geology, and that's how we're framing the rest of tonight. So sure, there's all sorts of programs that are on YouTube now that I've done, but it's this Ice Age Flood series And if you haven't seen it yet and you like the rest of tonight, all of these programs are waiting for you. And every one of them is like 2.5 hours long. So there's a lot of hours of material, and I'm getting all of that, more than 70 hours of stuff, down to 1 hour for us tonight. Or half an hour, I guess. So it's folks like this who were key players in what we're talking about. Okay, let's do it. So, did the Missoula floods happen? Yes. Did all the information that you've heard about the Missoula floods, is that all accurate and good information? Absolutely. But J. Harlen Bretz, back in the 1920s, the famous J. Harlen Bretz, who's usually tied to the Missoula floods, for many years in a row in the 1920s was not talking about the Missoula floods. He was talking about something called the Spokane flood, which was not one of the Missoula floods. And most importantly, the Spokane flood had a source of water coming from Canada and not a source of water from Montana. So I'm going to go backwards because I worked out a color scheme just to keep track of these narratives this past winter. So red was for the Missoula floods, and blue is for the Spokane flood. Those two colors, the rest of tonight will be tied to those two things. There's a lot of blue on this map. This is one of Bretz's first maps in the early 1920s. And I want you to notice a couple of things. These are the channeled scablands. They're colored blue. Here's Moses Coulee, Grand Coulee, Cheney Palouse is over here. This is the city of Spokane. What in the world? This guy's got ice over Spokane? That's not the Missoula flood story. The Missoula flood story, red, says that the ice dam is in northern Idaho, and water is bursting through that ice dam in northern Idaho, and water is going over Spokane. Why does this guy, Bretz, 100 years ago, have ice at Spokane? It's because it's a different ice advance. It's an older ice advance. It's not the same one. So right off the bat, now, I can feel the energy in the room. You're getting into this now. How many ice advances across the border are we talking about during the Ice Age? Well, how long is the Ice Age? It's 2.5 million years of time. 2.5 million years of time. And yet our Missoula flood story is usually talked about in the neighborhood of 20,000. Good dates, the only dates we really have, but I don't think anybody says it's radical to think that there were older ice advances. It's a discussion about how much can we get from those older ice advances. So Bretz's blue Spokane ice sheet is related to Bretz's blue Spokane flood. Let's keep going. So in a photo like this, which up until last winter I would have said, well, there you go, that's Steamboat Rock at the north end of Upper Grand Coulee, and there's a bunch of Banks Lake sediments that are sitting in the floor of Grand Coulee. Fine. But I did a video program in the field with Brian Atwater 3 years ago, this spring, and he just casually mentioned to me during that long interview, you know, Bretz and Richard Foster Flint assumed that the carving of Grand Coulee was long formed before these delicate sediments. That was awkward. Let me try it again. Atwater said, not all, no, third try. Atwater said to me, if you look at the Bretz stuff 100 years ago, he's saying that the Grand Coulee was carved long before these Missoula flood sediments. And I had never heard that before, which meant that I had never read Bretz's stuff from 100 years ago. And that's primarily what we did this past winter. We went paper after paper and interviewed geologist after geologist and chased that narrative of, is it possible to create these coulees and all of these exposed bedrock channels, is it possible to carve those long before the Missoula floods? And if it is, who did that work? So this very simple cartoon done with colorful Sharpie marking pens upstairs with the cat keeps coming up. That the basalt bedrock is carved during blue time, and God knows when that date is. I was running with the date of 150,000 years ago for the Spokane flood and the Spokane ice sheet, simply because we have a moraine isotope stage 6 now that's roughly 150,000 years ago worldwide. And then our red, our Missoula floods, perhaps, at least with this narrative we were exploring this winter, perhaps the Missoula floods are mostly just bringing in the deposits to sit in the canyon that's already been carved out. I mean, I got to be honest, I'm hesitating right now because a couple of the main geologists who've been not fans of this are in this room right now. They're curious about it. They're curious about it. We're all going to go look at these deposits next weekend in Spokane. But this is kind of going against the grain of the Missoula floods story, which is what we've been doing all winter, in a good-natured way. So now I look at a photo like this, just east of the Great Blade, and I say, I don't know, is that 150,000-year-old water that's carving those deep potholes and not the Missoula floods? That blue pickup truck and these enormous potholes that are drilled hydraulically into the bedrock, is that from an older flood and not the Missoula flood time? This is not the conventional story that's been told recently. Even if we go to our animations again from our Portland friends, is the coulee, is Dry Falls totally carved tens of thousands of years before we bring in the water? That's a little different than just saying the digging and the decorating is all happening in just a few thousand years during the Missoula floods time. That's quite a major departure from our story. So you've got it, Missoula floods, again, my narrative this winter, red, are the Missoula floods younger and possibly smaller than the Spokane flood, Bretz's Spokane flood, which was older and possibly bigger. Keep it going, boy. So these sketches then were trying to elaborate on the idea of Bretz's Spokane flood with the Spokane ice sheet. And notice that the water's coming across the border from Canada now. It's not coming from Montana at all. And notice from a map like this that we can look through the most recent ice or an older ice advance, and we can see all these incredible trenches, these all incredible north-south valleys that are crossing the border. It's just a political border. Why wouldn't we have major amounts of water coming across the border down through this corrugated landscape? We know the ice was on top of it multiple times. Why is it so radical to say that major amounts of Ice Age floodwater directly south of this ice sheet is coming from Canada? Why does everything have to come from Montana? So these don't seem to be that crazy to me, but again, if you're a fan of the Missoula floods, this is very foreign and maybe threatening and scary. Maybe you're looking for the nearest exit right now. How am I going to get out of here? I can't do another 20 minutes. I've been telling people in my car for the last 50 years about the Missoula floods. Am I going to have to go apologize and say I was wrong? No. We're just adding to the Missoula flood story. We're not taking anything away from that. So I have to include this last one just because of a nice little flourish by Chris Smart, who said, why don't we get video of an RV going by? Then we can bring the water in. Thank you, Chris. We got it. So, bringing in some human stuff. Bretz, J. Harlen Bretz, who's tied to the Missoula floods, did not discover Glacial Lake Missoula. That discovery was made long before Bretz even became a geology student at the University of Chicago. Joseph Pardee famously was tied to the first major paper on Glacial Lake Missoula in 1910. And here's Pardee, and Bill Burgle in this room is an authority on Joseph Pardee, among others. And these beautiful old photos from Sky Coulee help us see back this work more than 100 years ago. But the first guys to document some hint that something strange was happening in the Missoula area, we go back to the 1880s, and T.C. Chamberlain, which is a big name in geology, and R.D. Salisbury. Why include them? Well, they're going to intersect with Bretz a couple of decades later. Here's the 1885 paper buried in the USGS annual report talking about a curious phenomenon consisting of a series of parallel watermarks of the nature of exceptionally slight terraces sweeping around the sides of the valley and encircling the isolated hills within it like gigantic musical staves also occupied a portion of the region. I hint that something weird is going on, and maybe some sort of lake sat above Montana. Maybe a decade later, a student from the University of Wisconsin shows up, probably influenced by Salisbury and Chamberlain. He comes out and starts taking photos of these amazing images. So this is long before Bretz arrives on the scene. Why wasn't Bretz, who starts publishing on the Ice Age floods, talking about Glacial Lake Missoula? It was known by everyone in his small world, because I can't hold it. Bretz studied at the University of Chicago under T.C. Chamberlain and R.D. Salisbury. So they were the inventors of Glacial Lake Missoula. Bretz was studying under those two guys, and yet there's no talk of Glacial Lake Missoula until after January 1927, which we're about to get to. So photos from western Montana. Okay, yeah, we've got some red Glacial Lake Missoula sediments. We're fine. But this huge boulder's here, and then there's an older till underneath. How old is that older till? Is it possibly from a much older time? Yes, there's amazing giant current ripples on the floor of today's Glacial Lake Missoula. Tom Foster photo, classic. Draining Glacial Lake Missoula, one of many times perhaps. Amazing, huh? But I didn't want to just read the old papers. I want to go to the researchers that know this stuff the best today. So again, the purpose or the benefit of a live stream series is you can not only look into the camera in your office and read old-timey stuff and misread it half the time and stumble over words, but you can bring in, through Zoom, experts. And that also happened this winter. Larry Smith, one of the best experts he spent a whole career studying the sediments of Glacial Lake Missoula. He's a Missoula flood guy. I wore a red shirt for the occasion. That same red water is ponding in southern Washington. Let's go to a friend of mine who has Native American history and was willing to share a couple of stories about his people, the Yakama Nation, dealing with this Missoula water of Lake Lewis, where those slackwater sediments were being deposited. Let's go to Sean Wilsey, who knows some things about southern Idaho and the Bonneville flood. And can we then tie the Missoula story to the Bonneville flood? Sure we can. 18,000 years ago for the Bonneville flood, that's a flood coming down through the Snake River Canyon, Utah water coming through Hell's Canyon and dumping boulders at Lewiston, Idaho, and then relative age dating helps us that we do have some Missoula flood sediments, red water, younger than Bonneville. But I'm wearing a blue shirt. I didn't know it at the time, but I'm a blue guy. I want to think about older than Bonneville. I want to think about older than I want to explore those options. I'm just a teacher. I'm not trying to push any research of mine. I just want to keep asking questions. It's fun. This guy, Cooley, western Montana, he's now looking in his backyard in Polson, Montana, of two different generations of ice advance. 2 generations of ice advance. Look at this gorgeous glacial till in the Flathead Valley of Montana. Spectacular. Sky Cooley became a major part of this past winter's series, and he kept cranking out beautiful images like this and putting them on his blog. And he created this, apparently on a Saturday afternoon before one of the Sunday morning shows, showing from coast to coast, Washington on the left, all the way to New England on the right. Is it really that crazy to think about an older advance over Spokane and a younger advance not getting quite as far? When you consider that there's so much of that pattern across the United States and other continents as well? So we don't need to be obsessed with the 150,000-year-old date. That's just a working number from my attempts to teach this winter. There is evidence that we have some glacial ice advance 65,000 years ago worldwide during marine isotope stage 4, and then here's our red 20,000. And more to the point, if we're thinking and we're starting to really visualize an older flood carving some of the coulees, does it have to be blue? Can it be orange? Can the carving of the Grand Coulee be starting in the early red time? But it probably has to happen before the younger decorative time. So I went to more experts, both of them sitting in this room right now. I asked, I love the Spokane blue idea, the Spokane flood blue idea. Can we talk to some experts who know the Columbia River Gorge well? Because Bretz was spending a lot of time with his University of Chicago students in the Columbia River Gorge, pre-World War I, before he eventually ended up in channeled scablands of eastern Washington in the 1920s. So Jim O'Connor was brought in, and that's maybe the biggest surprise. I'll say it publicly, Jim. You were the biggest surprise this winter for me, to have a geologist of your reputation so engaged with what we were doing. That meant a lot to me. And so Jim was brought in, and it was a thrill to have him interviewed twice. And Jim said, I got no Spokane water for you. I know the gorge better. He didn't say it this way. I've spent my whole career looking at the Columbia River Gorge. I have no evidence of any dates older than 20,000 years ago, or older than 30,000 years ago, let's say. And so he's like, I hate to break it to you, but I see no evidence of the Spokane flood in the Columbia River Gorge. Well, that was kind of a bummer, because I had this whole thing going. But then I found a guy that you know as well, maybe better than Jim O'Connor, Scott Burns, who's also sitting, also thrilled to have Scott part of the series. And Scott's wearing a blue shirt. So am I. And Scott says, I do have some spots, at least one key spot above the Dalles, where I do have older dates than 30,000 years ago. And I do have the potential of some Spokane flood, or at least some older flood events that are higher and to the side of the inner gorge, or the lower spots of the Missoula scene in the Columbia River Gorge. So ultimately, modestly, I'm just trying to inspire new work. I hope if you take away nothing else from tonight, there's plenty of tantalizing questions that remain, and it hasn't all been figured out. And I think that is the thought from many, in geology and without geology, that, oh yeah, Missoula floods, Bretz, yeah, that's all. They gave him a medal at the end of his life. It's a happy, it's a Disney movie, it's done. There's nothing else to do. Look at these beautiful old maps that the American Geographical Society created for Bretz in the late 1920s. And there's again this ice sheet over Spokane. J. Harlen Bretz never gave up on a Spokane ice sheet over Spokane. And you're like, who cares? Here's why you should care. If you have the Spokane ice sheet in place over the city of Spokane, I'm not sure I can see how you can get Missoula floods to get from Montana into the channels of eastern Washington. There's too much ice in the way. And so it really boils down to, was this really an ice margin at some point? What the hell's going on here? The Mondovi Horseshoe, what is he seeing there? We're going to be going out there next weekend with all of the experts to look. So Bretz was brilliant, yes, but he was in large part telling a story that is not being told today. And I fully expected at some point this winter, honestly, I mean this honestly, I expected at some point in the middle of the series, I would get to a paper or a geologist who would firmly say, look, you're wasting your time. Even Bretz changed his mind. That Spokane flood thing is dumb, and he admitted it was wrong, and here's all the evidence we have from the last 50 years to prove that that's not a thing. But I didn't really get there. I didn't really hear that. I didn't hear that that was impossible to have that Spokane ice and that Spokane flood. So it'd be nice to continue with some of those discussions. Yeah, man, I didn't go full screen the whole time. Okay, great. More with the people part of the story, and then we're going to open it up to your questions. We're in the home stretch now. It's human stuff now, the rest of the way. We've done the heavy lifting. Why did Bretz know so much about glacial deposits? Well, he went to undergrad at Albion College in Michigan for a senior thesis by himself on a bicycle in Michigan on weekends. He made a glacial map. Fine. Then he starts teaching high school in Seattle. And what are they doing in Seattle between 1907 and 1911? They're digging all the hills open, and they're moving the hills. They're flushing them into Elliott Bay to make land for growth in downtown Seattle. And so J. Harlen Bretz for 4 years was teaching high school and taking his students to all of these priceless exposures of glacial deposits from the Puget Lobe, and he's like furiously taking notes because these hills are going away. They've been there for at least 20,000 years, and they're not going to be there the next year. And so the PhD dissertation that Bretz finally did after giving up high school teaching and going to the University of Chicago to be a graduate student is beautifully put together in this Washington Geological Survey. Still, the authority work on the ice sheet over Seattle. Beautiful old maps from J. Harlen Bretz, long before he showed up in eastern Washington. This is western Washington. Again, I wanted to keep toggling back and forth between the old-timey dudes and the people who are doing interesting work now. This was last Labor Day weekend, visiting with Kathy Troost, University of Washington. I met her at the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. I'm like, Kathy, can we make a video? She's like, I guess. I don't know. I haven't really seen much of your stuff. I'm like, I just have this little iPhone and a little gizmo. It'll be fine. Kathy, do you have any evidence of multiple ice advances over Seattle? And she said, well, of course. I've got 3 different tills, and there probably were 3 more below. I'm like, you're kidding me. I didn't know that. Can you show me? And so this video is there to just go right down to tide level, and she's showing me 3 separate, well-defined, well-dated glacial tills in Puget Sound. The Double Bluff, blue, stage 6, for sure, according to her work. The Possession, stage 4, and she's got the Vashon, stage 2. So why is it okay for us to have 3 well-developed ice advances over Seattle and only have 1 getting kind of close to Spokane, but no ice ever getting over Spokane? Seems kind of weird to me. Bretz, back to the human story, only taught 1 year, his first college teaching job at the University of Washington. He was just a high school teacher. This is his dream job. But he only lasts 1 year. But while he's in Seattle for that 1 year, newspaper articles are beautiful like this. The first of 3 popular science lectures to be given under the auspices of the Mountaineers in Seattle will take place tonight in the hall of the Postal Telegraph Building. The speaker being Professor J. Harlen Bretz of the University of Washington, and his subject, Geology of Puget Sound. There will be many lantern slides, no technical language, and no charge of any kind. December of 1913. So I'm now going to the viewers more and more. I'm like, God, viewers, I would love to be able to find the house that Bretz lived in. It's weird, but I'm just curious. Can anybody find anything? Use your Google machine. So emails start pouring in. Somebody says, I found this magazine, and it says in the text that it was owned by Bretz. I'm like, next live stream. Hey, can anybody figure out how to find this house? Probably not, but like, I don't know. Is somebody creative in figuring this out? So somebody said, well, I found a birth certificate of Bretz's first son, Rudolph, born on July 12th, 1914. And here's the address of the house. And the bungalow article was this brand new house that was just built. So Bretz has got this new job at the University of Washington. This college sweetheart family is in town. They've got their first son. He's got his dream job at the University of Washington. And they leave 3 weeks later. It didn't work out due to some stuff we'll probably never know, but there was a personality conflict, I guess, between the 2 assistant professors. But back to the story, did we find the house? Well, we got the address. So I can just sit in my upstairs office in Ellensburg, Washington, and get on Google Maps, and there it is. It still stands. Bretz's house that he built with his brand new baby. So I haven't visited this house. I don't want to bother these folks. They do know that they live in Bretz's house. There's a little neighborhood tour, walking tour, and it's in the brochure. But it was fun just screwing around on Street View and Google Maps, being kind of snoopy. What did the viewers do? Another viewer says, Rudolph Bretz. I interviewed Rudolph Bretz In Malibu, California, I've got the old VHS tape. Can you convert it to a digital thing? I'm like, yeah, I think I could. So on my website is a portion of Bretz's son remembering the days when he was out with his dad in Eastern Washington as a kid. Bretz's house, Bretz's alley, Bretz's basketball hoop. Just kidding. Even that kind of detail, he had a little mountain here carved into his side. I presume that's the original siding of the house. It's kind of bittersweet when I see these folks, you know. They had their hopes and dreams tied to that job. Well, back to Seattle, we now have new imagery, of course, to get beneath and see these amazing structures. This LiDAR imagery, beautifully put together by Daniel Coe. So this is long after Bretz's work, but of course the guy had it all figured out with hardly any outcrops to work with whatsoever. Fluted topography in the Bremerton area. Still in Puget Lowland, we're getting to the eastern Washington scablands in just a few minutes. Huge erratics, glacial erratics everywhere. Fluted landscape, we have, okay, so I'll tell you one other thing. The main thing, the biggest thing that the viewers did for our learning community is that a couple of viewers, one from Springfield, Illinois says, I know that Bretz's journals are at the University of Chicago. I'm going to drive up one day and take some pictures of some of Bretz's notebooks at the University of Chicago, and I'll email them to you. And so he did that, and that was nice, and we celebrated. We had a little bit of Bretz's original notebooks. And then another guy, Brian, from Portland, said, I'm just going to email the librarian there and see if we can get some scans done. And somehow he convinced him to do it. So then we had scans of Bretz's original field notebooks. But right before the alphabet series began, in mid-November, I got an email from the University of Chicago and said, we're aware that it's weird. We got all these people wanting to visit Bretz's notebooks. And then they caught on to what was going on, and they said, nicely but firmly, you cannot post on your website Bretz's notebooks unless you have permission from the family. So the next live stream, I go to the viewers and I say, you got to help me, Matt. And we figure out how to find a living descendant of J. Harlen Bretz. Is that possible? Of course. All sorts of it. So I started emailing with J. Harlen Bretz's great-grandson, who lives in Massachusetts. And he said, of course, we would be happy and honored to have the work of our beloved J. Harlen Bretz publicly available. So that opened the floodgates with the University of Chicago. So before we quit here, I'll show you the website where you can get to every one of these years of Bretz's notebooks. And we can confirm then he's been at all these spots we've been talking about. All these spots today that have a glacial story in Washington, in the gorge. It's all Bretz. He went to every spot. He was insatiable. He was working under these two guys when he was a student, and then when he gave up his job, when he gave up his job at the University of Washington, he went right back to the University of Chicago and became an assistant professor. So he was then colleagues with these guys. But what did he do every summer? He had a few graduate students from the University of Chicago, and he came back out to the Pacific Northwest year after year. He started in Seattle. He worked his way to Chehalis. He got himself down to you guys in Portland. And again, as I mentioned, before World War I, he started doing intensive mapping work in the Columbia River Gorge. The Columbia River Gorge. He didn't have a car. He took the train out from Chicago with 3 grad students, and they were working in the gorge by rail and by walking and by pack mule and working their way through the gorge. And at the time, a brand new highway was being constructed, the Columbia River Highway. Many of you know it. Pieces of it you can still get to. And these jewels of newspaper articles from some of those summers. Here's September 1919. Student geologists in Oregon country. Legends of Bridge of the Gods and Maiden's Hands are both shown untrue. This is Bretz dealing with the press and his students and interviews with all these folks. So Sharon turned out to be our main newspaper clipping person. I don't know how she did it, but she can search better than anybody with these search engines. And so we had all this rich detail, also available to you if you're interested, from Sharon. The Columbia Gorge, maybe you don't think of as a key J. Harlen Bretz area. Maybe you do, since we're in Portland. But Bretz was intimately associated with the building and the interpretation of the geology on this new highway in the gorge. Along the new highway, beyond Hood River in a Chevrolet. So the first roadside geology book, I think, ever, was co-authored by Bretz. Ira Williams was the lead author. Here are all of Bretz's notes now. It's okay to publish them now. It's okay for us to look at them. We have permission. All these typed up notes by J. Harlen Bretz on the way back home every summer from his field work. This is all detailed from the story. But here's this roadside geology guide that sold out apparently immediately by Ira Williams. And they published another edition and maybe a third edition. Amazing highway. You can imagine the excitement of getting your own automobile and just going whenever you want it up the gorge. What a luxury to be able to do that through Mitchell Point in the tunnels. Again, this was where Bretz is cutting his teeth and realizing there's something upstream. There's something upstream. Why do we have such massive erosion, fluvial erosion, in the lower parts of the walls of the gorge? And he's recording much of this in his journals from the gorge, pre-World War I. One of his students, the last summer in the Columbia River Gorge, was his bitter enemy later in life, Richard Foster Flint. Flint was one of his University of Chicago students, and they climbed Mount Adams together in the summer of 1921. Okay, yeah, both handwritten and typed up notes by Bretz, all available to you. I don't know why that slide's so dark, but we'll just keep moving. The story goes that Thomas Large, a high school teacher in Spokane, invited two key people to the Spokane area to help his high school teaching. J. Harlen Bretz from the University of Chicago and Joseph Pardee, who we've already met, from the USGS. But there's reasons to wonder about that. I'll say it right now before I forget. More work by the viewers has found some Pardee journals that go back to 1920. And Pardee is going around in eastern Washington and talking about floods of water. So the story that Large is just inviting Pardee in 1921 or 1922 to come check things out, Bretz is there even before Thomas Large becomes a high school teacher in Spokane. And Jim O'Connor in the audience tonight has been going through those notes, those journals, and trying to piece some of that story together. But again, Christmas time, I said I'm taking a break for a couple of weeks to spend time with family. All of our kids are coming home, but I can't hold it. Can I come into my office and ask, does anybody live in Eugene? I've heard that these notes of Thomas Large, the high school teacher in Spokane, all of his papers are in the Knight Library at the University of Oregon. And this is the part that gets me emotional every time. So we have strangers all appearing at this library in late December, a half a dozen of them, introducing them, said, are you here for the Thomas Large? Yes. And they just got in there and took photos of every last paper by this high school teacher and emailed them to me, and then we dove in and enjoyed the Large papers, which was a key part of the Spokane discoveries. So when we were done with the series, after the series, interviewed many of those folks. Those are also available to watch, and the story of how these folks got together to put the Thomas Large part of the story together. So Bretz is borrowing Large's car in the summer of 23. They broke it. So here's a handwritten note from Bretz to Large saying, I'm sorry we screwed up your car. Here's a personal check. Go buy yourself a new car. The boys think you should buy a new one. I'm sorry, but your loan of your car played a key role in our discoveries together this summer. Lots of intimate relations between Large and Bretz. This is just a sampling of some of these beautiful letters. More fun than I've ever had before. in haste, Bretz. He was really loving life as a field geologist in the 1920s. Out here every summer, back in his office in the University of Chicago every winter. These notebooks by Bretz at the University of Chicago, essentially under lock and key and only seen by a couple of key veteran geologists and also novelists. John Sonicson wrote a book on Bretz. Just a few people had gone to those notes but had not gotten the ability to make them public. So the work of the viewers made all this stuff available to all of us. And it continues to be a rich resource. Back to Spokane and pushing this idea one more time, maybe inappropriately, I don't know. Smaller red, bigger blue, 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 Bretz's notebooks, typed summer after summer. Well, now we have more viewers and they say, I want to know where these places are. I need to visualize where Bretz was every day of every summer. I'm going to make some maps and I'm going to make them mostly for myself, but I'm going to share them with the rest of the community. I can't keep all these places straight. And so these kinds of notes were then gone through very, very carefully by a couple of key viewers. Here's the summer of 1923, a map made by Joel in Sacramento, California. Every day of Bretz's summer, he was just 1 month, his field season of 1922, August. The red is where they were walking, Bretz and his students, and dry camping. And the brown railroad tracks are where they were hopping trains for a while and then getting off. But this guy turned out to be the biggest and most prolific, and continues to be, of the viewers. A guy that I didn't know before. But Glenn in Spokane says, I had a whole history with Google Earth and that development of that software, and I'm retired, like everybody else. I got time. Can I help you? Can I go through every page of Bretz's notebooks, and can I put them on Google Earth? Can I by hand put each of these sites from all of these Bretz notebooks, and people can go to Google Earth and they can fly around and they can visit and they can read Bretz's notes at each of these sites. So Glenn from Spokane is officially out of control, even today. Never met the guy before this thing started. He didn't know about me till the pandemic in the backyard thing. It all kind of works together. So here I asked Glenn's a humble guy, but I said, would you please tell me how many pages of Bretz's notes did you read carefully? More than 1,000. How many green thumbtacks did you put on Google Earth by hand? More than 1,500. How many field days did J. Harlen Bretz spend in Eastern Washington? More than 300 field days. That alone makes me want to listen to this guy. It's not even close compared to other field geologists in Eastern Washington. Are you kidding me? More than 300 field days? And we're supposed to take most of that work and just go, oh, it's old, it's kind of dusty, not that important. I'm sure we know more now. I'm not sure we do. I'm not sure we do. It's worth to go back and revisit so many of these sites. Bretz was over in Montana, finally. Okay, I'm wrapping up, but I want to do two more final things before we get to some questions. One, just the map-making ability by Bretz. This was his equipment. And he mostly did not have a topographic base map. He did in some places. But in other places with his students, there was no base map to use. So he's using this aneroid barometer to measure elevations. And then he'd come back the next year and double check the elevation. And this is from Glenn. You know Glenn now. This is from Glenn, a modern map. And here's Glenn taking Bretz's map, done by hand and foot. He never got up in the air. And using that little handheld barometer. Look at how perfectly this absolutely handmade map is compared to the imagery we have from space now. That alone, regardless of the geology, that alone is worth some sort of medal. It is really incredible. These places still look mostly like this today. The car looks different, but there's still gravel roads and columnar basalt and a couple of little scrubs and some chuckers that startle you as you hike through the area. Eventually, Bretz did, in 1925, bring a car out and brought his family out. So that's when young Rudy and his sister Rhoda would come out together and experience the channeled scablands where their dad would go every summer. Bretz, 1926. Why is he up in British Columbia? He's spending the entire summer of 1926 in British Columbia. I think you know the answer. He's looking for a cause of his flood coming across the border. And he's looking for lavas that perhaps erupted underneath the Canadian ice sheet to create the amount of water necessary. A yokulop. He was writing the word yokulop in his notes from 1926. And he was having a blast. He was finding things that he thought were definitely the right age to produce the Spokane flood. More newspaper accounts. Seek source of the glacial flood. Notes from British Columbia. Look at these maps that are starting to emerge from Bretz. All these channel heads are just stopping. Why? They're not connected to anything. Bretz is saying that the ice sheet is right there at the head of each of these channels, and the water is being released like a fire hose. So in late December of 1926, Bretz gives an oral presentation at a GSA meeting, an annual GSA meeting, the cause of the Spokane flood. What caused it? And he's tentative in saying that the field has not yet been sufficiently studied, but he's kind of on to this yokulop idea. And from the notes and the letters in the collections, Bretz is a joke. He's the butt of everybody's joke at these conferences. He's giving his talk, he's getting all sorts of rebuttals in real life. He was not accepted. He was a crazy guy by many. And 2 weeks later, he goes to Washington, D.C., and meets with the leading geologists of the day at the Cosmo Club. And a half a dozen leading Ice Age experts from the USGS listened to a 2-hour program by Bretz, and he worked months on that program. And after his 2 hours were done, he sat down, and one by one, each USGS man stood up and told him how impossible it was to have a catastrophic flood. And he went through a bit of a depression. That lasted a few months. And then that summer, he went back to every one of those spots and double-checked every work. And his writing changed completely after that. He's now talking to his critics instead of just talking generically. In the summer of 1928, in the summer of 1929, courtesy of Glenn, he doubled down on his efforts to prove that there was outrageous floods of water. But one big change. He started talking about Montana. He started talking about Missoula. He shifted away from the yokulop. He never went back to Canada to find those narratives. And I still am not sure. Did he shift to Missoula because it was a known source of water and it was more palatable to his critics? Or did he truly shift to Missoula and start talking about the Missoula floods because he really did find evidence that proved that his earlier work was erroneous? There's no evidence of that, as far as I can tell, in his papers and his notes. I promise we're finishing with this. My favorite letter in all of these collections. In retirement years, Harlen Bretz is 97 years old. Aaron Waters, who grew up in Waterville, on the Waterville Plateau, I can't make this stuff up. Waters wrote a handwritten note to Bretz from his home in Santa Cruz, California, September 8th, 1978. Dear J. Harlen, thank you very much for sending me a copy of the Vic Baker fine book on the scablands. It is nice to see that they give credit where credit is due to the man who walked the weary hundreds of miles and made the countless accurate observations that put the whole thing together. Today, with the stunning satellite photographs, abundance of paved roads, and outstanding cuts made by the dam builders, irrigation engineers, and road builders, the documentation they have given was easy to get. Not so when you engaged in the hard physical labor that made your documentation possible. To me, as a country kid who grew up on the Waterville Plateau, it is a delight to see that this later work, supported by quote-unquote floods of NASA and NSF dollars, and supplemented by photographs, maps, and ease of travel, has done little to document, but a great deal to confirm the hypothesis. No, the proof that you offered equipped with little more than a pair of sturdy legs and a particularly agile and observing mind. Dollars and what they buy are never equivalent to what a brilliant mind and determination will do. Yours is the glory, and I salute you. Best wishes, Aaron Walters. It was Bretz that underlined that in red. So Bretz passed away shortly after that, received the Penrose Medal, the highest award possible, made possible by the gentleman that's sitting in this room and also on the right side of this photograph, Dr. Vic Baker. Dr. Vic Baker and colleague Richard Waite are now in advanced years, and it's time for the next generation of Ice Age floods geologists to continue this work. A young star is Joel Gombiner, mentored by Brian Atwater. Joel Gombiner, Sky Cooley, Jerome Lessman, these are folks who are thinking and writing on the floods today. Lots of work continues, lots of thinking, brainstorming, creative work, and also field work using new techniques. A brand new paper came out just last month, co-authored by Joel and Jerome, talking about Bretz's original idea of subglacial flow across the border from Canada and dumping directly into Moses Coulee. Mapped for the first time tunnel channels, interpreted as tunnel channels across the Waterville Plateau and continuing up to the Omak Plateau. And places like Moses Coulee, with now beautiful imagery by Joel Gombiner, and accentuated by animations where we can see these uplifting ridges against these former pre-glacial rivers, helps us interpret some of these field relationships. For the first time? No. Bretz had it all figured out a century ago. If you want to see all this stuff, this is the website. If you click on the word Bretz or you click on the word floods in the upper right-hand corner, it still looks like this if you go there tonight before you fall asleep. All of these papers, all of these Google Earth files, all of these Bretz notebooks, they're all there. Hundreds of documents that will compile episode by episode throughout the course of this winter. And they will remain so that you can enjoy countless hours of work with Harlen Bretz and everything else. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate your attention. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we're going to do some questions here.
Yeah, if you have some questions, please raise your hand. And Carol, did we have a lot of questions?
There's nothing online.
No questions from online. You're going to let me off easy.
Okay.
Either that or you covered the topic completely.
Yes, Andrew, hi.
Howdy. In your time doing the A to Z series, did you get to turbidite records?
The question is, yeah, if you've had enough, you want to escape, don't feel like you're in prison here, that's fine. The question is, did I get into turbidite records offshore?
Yeah.
That tie potentially to the Ice Age floods? Yes and no. Joel Gombiner, who was a regular part of the series, was very helpful in going through one deep core in the Astoria fan. It's mostly sandy material. I'm not sure if they're interpreted as turbidites necessarily, but interpreted by most as the results of Ice Age floods coming down the Columbia and then dumping out onto the Astoria fan. Joel was careful to say there's only one hole in this entire fan, so it's a pretty limited data set. But Joel's point was there are some dates recorded within the fan, and 1/3, the upper third of the Astoria fan is red, Missoula flood time, but 2/3 of the sand in that core are older than 20,000 years ago, potentially tied to some of these older floods. So there's another place that could be, we could spend lots of more research time on the Astoria fan. Let's keep it going. Yeah, I'm just happy to repeat questions if you're okay with doing it that way. Yeah.
So I have a question if there's been any dating and essentially genesis of the erratics that have been found tied to the Okanagan and British Columbia that would support the Spokane flood theory and not just source from Montana and northern Idaho.
Thank you. The question involves the erratics, the big boulders that are deposited by the floodwaters, it appears, or even the erratics are deposited by the ice sheet itself. And the question is more tied to the Okanagan. Like, what can you do with those erratics to prove that they came with floodwater from the north as opposed to coming from Montana? If it was easier to do, we would have it by now, I think. The dates we have on the erratics that were brought in have dates that are younger than 30,000 years, and many of the lithologies of those erratics tie to Montana, which is why it's such a strong case that there are Missoula floods. But there are lots of granite boulders and metamorphic boulders that appear to match to the Okanagan and across to southern BC, but it's frustrating to not have enough people working on tying boulder rock types with source rock types. That would be a huge step forward, but there's just a handful of people doing this work. And that, anytime I lead a field trip, that's a question that usually comes up. Can't you just take that erratic that you're sure is an ice rafted erratic? Can't you just figure out where that came from? Why are we wondering? Well, there's a lot of ground to cover, and another way to answer that is it's usually Pleistocene geologists working on this, and oftentimes they don't have the igneous geochemistry background. You need a versatile person who can work in multiple areas of geology. A few more. Yes, blue shirt. Yeah, I like your blue shirt.
Do you think that the Pacific Northwest glaciation that you're talking about is independent of or correlated to the, we'll say, east of the Rockies, Michigan and all of that glaciation? And if they are correlated, wouldn't globally static sea level curves give you the key to how many glacial advances and retreats you would have had in this period?
Thank you for the question. The question involves taking the multiple ice advances here in the Northwest and how much work has been done to correlate those multiple ice advances here with different ice advances across the country, and then tying those to sea level changes and other fluctuations in the ocean. My sense is that a bunch of that work has been done, but not enough correlation between those data sets. Again, I bring up Joel Gombiner, who showed a few curves in a couple of those episodes where Joel said, yeah, we do have evidence within the marine isotope stage record, for instance, that we had, let's say, take your pick, 33 advances and retreats of the ice worldwide, but there were 4 big mega glacials younger than 1 million years ago. And if you have that in the marine record, are we going right back to what many of us old-timers were taught in classrooms in the 1960s and 70s and 80s? I was taught at the University of Wisconsin that there were 4 major ice advances. The Nebraskan, the Kansan, the Illinois, and the Wisconsin. And I stopped teaching that because I was told that there were 33, but now as you start looking at different strengths within those signatures, it is possible perhaps to do a little bit more correlation worldwide and go back to some of these major advances. I think so much of this, it feels to me, is right there. And it's just the synthesis and the momentum and just needing a few more dozen young people to work on some of this stuff. It doesn't have to be the floods, just generally worldwide. And I think we would have the correlations that you're wanting. Thank you for the question. Carol.
Yeah, so Susan.
Yeah.
Karen from online says thank you and nice things.
Thank you.
And, the question is, what 1 or 2 points do you you want to take away from the talk tonight? Maybe do you want us to pick one?
Thank you. Someone at home asking, are there a couple of main things to take home from tonight? Well, the first one I've already hammered a few times. There is all sorts of work that can be done and hopefully will be done in the next generation or two. That would be really nice to see. Apparently it's difficult to get funding to do this work, but that doesn't make sense to me. I don't understand why you can't get funding to do this work and you can get plenty of funding to do what seems to me pretty esoteric stuff. So this is stuff that's loved by so many of us. Why can't you get some funding dollars to do that? So hopefully to inspire some new work. But the other main thing is that I went deeply into the work before Bretz, because I think Bretz was heavily influenced by geologists, Bailey Willis, Israel Russell, I didn't tell those stories, George Otis Smith, many others in the late 1900s who laid the groundwork for his work. And so it's not typically the story of Bretz showing up, dropping out of the sky, and putting this all together, and then nobody listening to him for most of his life. It's a more nuanced, of course, complicated story that starts much earlier. And there was some satisfaction for me to get into that stuff that was much older than Bretz and try to explore that as well. So Bretz is of his time, but also certainly ahead of his time with much of what he was doing. Yes? Yes?
Yes. I'm wondering why the Missoula flood happened at the height of the Ice Age. One would think that more of that water would be frozen, as it were, into the Big Bering Strait, not as high at that time.
Thank you. The question is, why would the Missoula floods happen at the height of the Ice Age? Wouldn't it happen slightly after? There's many dates. I'm just using the number 20,000, but that's a ballpark number, and you probably know this, that there's a whole range of dates that are slightly younger than 20,000 years ago that does kind of work as we're coming out of that last glacial maximum. So I think we do have the dates from this most recent ice advance that the major floods are as we're coming out and not truly at the height of that advance. But how about the height of the stage 4 ice advance and the height of the stage 6 ice? As we go further back in time, it gets so hard to get any meaningful dates. There are some paleomagnetic signature dates that are reversed, telling us some floods happened older than 780,000 years ago. There's some calcrete horizons that take hundreds of thousands of years to develop, and there are flood deposits below those calcretes. So there's some rough ideas that we can go much earlier, even more than 1 million years ago, to get some floods. But it's the precision and the detail. You know this in geology. The further back in time you go, the fuzzier it gets. Hard to get the real precise stuff that you want. Young lady.
Okay, so you mentioned that there was cosmogenic dating done on some of the erratics,
Yes.
correct? So was there any additional chemical analyses done on that to kind of track some of these origins, or?
So far, the main work by Andrea Balbus involves the cosmogenic exposure dates from selected key boulders around the Pacific Northwest. It's really only one study that I'm aware of. But John Stone from the University of Washington has done some of this work as well. So from my knowledge, we have less than 20 accurate surface exposure dates from careful selections of the most key boulder selections. That's it as far as I know. And then to get into the chemistry of the boulders and then work with the sources, which I think is partly what you're asking, can be done. We have the tools, we just don't have the people. Sir, yeah.
So you said there both is and isn't evidence for floods older than 20,000 years.
Yes. Which is it?
No, I mean, is there like isotopic, can you bring those two camps together? Like, are they arguing on isotopic? Is there some common point where they're like, no, that absolutely can't mean that, or no, that absolutely does mean that?
That's kind of what I was thinking we would get. So the question involves, do we have good dates that prove these older ice advances, where we can say for sure there are these older ice advances? Or are there some key discoveries that say there could not have been older than 30,000-year-old dates of floods? Most of the dates, accurate dates we have, are younger than 30,000 years ago. And so most of the story is told in that time frame. But some of these field relations and older horizons that are roughly older, but clearly older, based on some of these other techniques I'm not talking about tonight. If we could only get dates older than 30,000 years ago, that would change the discussion. And maybe a few people say, I have dates. Nobody's just liking my dates. But we need another leap forward in getting absolute age dates from some of these old, what appear to be older deposits. How about 3 more? And then we can talk. I'm happy to stick around as long as you want afterwards. We'll eventually go outside and talk in the middle of the night. Yes?
You had mentioned, I think, something about Scott having found evidence of an older flood in the gorge.
Yes.
And what type of evidence was that?
Scott Burns has been asked the question.
So outside of the Dalles on Highway 197, which goes to the south, we have Dave Cordero did his master's degree thesis many years ago. We have reworked that whole section. And so what we have got is on top some, well, first at the northern end of that section, it's a beautiful road cut. We actually, what I interpret, at Dave Cordero, as the traditional Missoula flood sediments 15 to 20,000 years ago. But then at a higher elevation, we have some paleosols. I'm a dirt guy. And so there are 3 or 4 paleosols in Lewis. And then you go down to older caliche horizons that you have got. And there are 3 or 4 of those, and we've actually found in the past some sediments that are granitic. And then we have Chris Pluhars of Fresno State went in, and we have sediments, lake sediments there, and he's got the Brunus-Matayama boundary, which is 600,000 years ago.
What's that?
The Brunus-Matayama boundary is where the Earth's magnetic field, the North Pole became the South Pole became the North Pole. And so that is a really neat one. And I actually talked to Chris this last week. He said, Burns, when are you going to get that paper out with that? And so I think we need to get this, and then we've done all the particle size on all of the sediments in there, of the soils and the deposition. And so we believe that it is an older one. Also, we found a major deposit down outside of Corvallis of a paleosol in the on the Breton surface, which is an older one, with a granitic boulder in it that is fully weathered, and which shows also older ones. And so we're following up on that one using the leads of Frank Reckendorf down there. So those are a couple things. We're going to have a fun summer, I think, in the gorge looking at this. And Jim has looked at it. Doesn't quite agree with me. But we have a lot of soil things, and we'll see what will happen. It'll be fun. Maybe Nick will run another show on that. So I'm going to pass this back down.
Thank you, Scott. How about 2 more? Oh, yeah. Scott Burns. 2 more, way in the back. Yes, sir.
So the concept of older, bigger, younger, smaller,
Yeah.
is that like volume of water? Because it would seem like the first flood through gets the easy work of carrying off the flour. It would take a lot more water to be able to carry off the basalt that's underneath it. So
Yes.
the volume of the water, in my mind, doesn't seem to match up with older, bigger, younger, smaller.
Thank you. That's just a slogan that I came up with about halfway through the alphabet. Older, bigger, younger, smaller. There's 2 ways to interpret what I'm saying. One is just the ice sheet itself. So that Spokane ice sheet, the blue ice, was a little bit bigger than the red ice, which came later. So older ice is extending further south than the younger ice, the red ice. But that's not what you're commenting on. I'm back to thinking about the Grand Coulee and Moses Coulee and other flood features and the concept that Atwater suggested and Bretz and Flint all saw, that the older features are the carving features, which means we need a much bigger flood, a bigger, older flood to carve the holes. And then the younger, smaller floods have less energy, and they're bringing in the erratics, they're bringing in the slack water sediments, they are decorating the features. So, part of your question was the loess and sweeping the loess away. I'm seeing that all as part of the younger, smaller story, just as I'm reading Bretz's work. So how do you document the older, bigger story if there's nothing left to get a date on? All you have are these scars. So you can see the challenge in trying to really prove that the older, bigger story happened long ago. One more, and we're done as a group. Yes, Carol.
You just made me think of another question.
Sure. That's
Given
good.
that, has anyone studied the loess?
Yes.
And the origins, when those deposits were made? Is that another way to look at it?
It is, thank you. Last question of tonight, as a group. Has anybody studied the loess? Is all of the loess the same age? Or are there multiple ice advances tied to the loess? The answer is yes, and that didn't make this show. It probably should have. We had a full episode with Mark Sweeney from the University of South Dakota. And Mark has 3 distinctly different ages of loess right at Washtenaw, Washington, right off the State Route 26. Blue, orange, and red. And even better than that, he has about a dozen other paleosols older than those 3 dated things. So just in the one hill that's been cut to put in Highway 26 going to Pullman, we have easily 8 different batches of loess of progressively older stuff. And if you tie the loess generation with an ice sheet in the neighborhood, that's another promising, maybe the most promising way to get some real numbers on ice advances, and potentially the older, bigger, younger stalling. I'm happy to visit with whomever wants to visit with up here, and then out the door we go, but thank you for your attention tonight.